Welcome to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Sarah Jane Leslie. Suppose that a student has a paper due the next day. Her friends invite her to come with them to the movie theater that night, and she thinks to herself, well, she would much prefer to go to the movies with her friends, but then she reflects and she realizes that if she stays home instead to write that paper, then she'll be glad she did so. This is a pattern of reasoning that we employ all the time in everyday life. We think, well, if we'll be glad we did something, then that really is the thing that surely we ought to do. It's a pattern of reasoning that helps us delay gratification, that helps us focus on the best outcome in the long run, rather than just being seduced by immediate gratification. Consider, however, a rather different case. Imagine that there's a 14-year-old girl who's contemplating getting purposely pregnant. She thinks to herself, well, if I have this child, I'll love the child. I'll come to be so glad to have this child in my life. As a parent, I'll obviously be so glad that I have this child. So in essence, she thinks to herself, if I get pregnant now at 14 on purpose, I'll be glad I did so. I think we can all agree that this is not a good application of I'll be glad I did it reasoning, but what is actually the difference between the two? Why do we think that in the one case, the fact that the student will be glad she wrote her paper gives her reason to stay home and write the paper, but we don't think in the case of a teenage mother contemplating purposely becoming pregnant that the fact she'll be glad to have that child in her life gives her reason to conceive now instead of waiting until a future time when she's better equipped to deal with the stresses of being a parent. Professor Liz Harman draws our attention to a far more controversial case where she thinks the same kind of pattern of reasoning is being employed. In recent years, medical technology has made it possible for deaf infants to receive cochlear implants that allow them to hear, in many cases, noises around them. If an infant is implanted early enough, then she'll be able, in many cases, to grow up to acquire spoken language in the typical sort of manner. Now, many advocates in the deaf community strongly oppose the use of these cochlear implants. And in particular, one line of argument that gets offered against them goes as follows. I'm a deaf adult. My parents chose not to implant me as an infant with one of these cochlear implants, and so I've grown up deaf. And being deaf has shaped who I am in so many ways. It affects my speech community, it affects the people that I interact with, it affects my entire way of being in the world. It's really made me who I am. And my parents love me as I am. They don't wish that they had some qualitatively different person as their child. They're glad that they have me. Joining us today to discuss these issues is Professor Elizabeth Harman. Dr. Harman is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Center for Human Values at Princeton University. She received her PhD from MIT and has previously held an appointment at NYU. She's the author of numerous articles in ethics. Professor Harman, it's so great to have you with us today. Now, just focusing on the case of the student trying to decide whether or not to go to the movies versus the case of the teenager trying to decide whether or not to conceive, what is the difference between these cases? Why is I'll be glad I did it reasoning good in the one case, but clearly defective in the other?
Well, I think often when one predicts that one will be glad that one did something, it's true that one will be glad if one does this, and also one will be glad because it really will be for the best. And it really is the thing that you should do. And what makes it the thing that you should do is also what makes it the case that you'll be glad you did it. And that's what's true in the paper case. So when trying to decide whether to write the paper or go to the movies, the student realizes that she'll be glad she wrote the paper. And that's really, and it's true that she'll be glad she wrote the paper. And that's really because it really is best to write the paper. And her life will go better if she writes the paper. And given all of her reasons, it really is the thing to do. But by contrast, Sometimes one regrets something or is glad that something happened, but one isn't having that attitude because of the features that really determine whether it's the right choice to make. So for example, in my view, we have reasonable attachments to the people that we love, but that doesn't always mean that the choices that led us to these people were the right choices. So a teenager who's imagining conceiving a child now may correctly predict that if she conceives a child now, she will love the child, and the nature of love, especially parental love, is such that you don't wish that something different had happened. You don't wish that your child didn't exist, even if it would have been better for you. And so there's certain cases in which we might be reasonable in having a preference that is disconnected from what would have been the right choice to make. And I think that the choice whether to conceive is a kind of case like that.
So very often when we employ "I'll be glad I did it" reasoning, there's some feature of the outcome in question that is objectively good. It's better than its counterpart, and that's what we're responding to in these cases. But then there may be other situations in which some kind of personal attachment could lead us to have a reasonable preference for what's objectively a worse state of affairs. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's my view. And in particular, sometimes who you love or the nature of that someone that you love might lead you to have a reasonable preference for how things actually are, even though it would have been a better choice to make a very different choice and to have had things go very differently.
Now, another possible analysis of the difference between these two cases is that suppose the student opted to go to the movies and didn't stay home to write the paper, the student wouldn't be glad that she made that choice. However, in the teenage mother case, it seems that if she makes the different choice and delays conception until she's in a better position to take care of a child, then she'll also be glad that she made that choice. Could another way of understanding the difference between these cases be to compare whether you get the same outcome whether or not you make the choice?
I do think that thinking about whether you'll be glad you did it in the other option is helpful. It's a helpful guide. It can reveal that you might be in a case where you should be suspicious of "I'll be glad I did it" reasoning. So I agree with you that in the teenage mother case, it really does seem significant that although if she conceives now, she'll be glad she did it, it's also true that if she doesn't conceive now, she'll probably have a child later, she'll love that child, and she'll have the same kind of strong desire for things as they are. She'll be glad that she waited in a similar way to the way that she would be glad if she conceived now. The fact that she could run "I'll be glad I did it" reasoning for either choice shows that it can't tell her which way she should go in this case. So I think that that's a good way of seeing that something is going wrong with the reasoning. But I don't think that that tells us what goes wrong with the reasoning.
So now, applying your analysis of the difference between the two obvious cases of considering going to the movies versus considering conceiving as a teenager, how does that apply to the more controversial case of cochlear implants?
I think that there have been some bad arguments against the use of cochlear implants. So I think that some people reflect on their own cases of having grown up deaf, and they think, "I'm glad I'm the person I am. I can't identify with whom I would have been if I had been raised after having a cochlear implant." And they think, well, I don't wish it were that way, so a preference for that alternative is misguided in general, even when we're talking about the case of a baby. And I think that the mistake that gets made in that line of thought is moving from what's appropriate, what's reasonable to prefer now after things have unfolded in a certain way versus what would be reasonable to prefer at the choice point when a child is a baby. Once someone has grown up into the particular person that they are, it's completely reasonable to love the person as they are, to prefer things as they are to how they would have been because this particular person is valued by the people who know him or her. But when we have a baby, the baby hasn't yet turned out a particular way, and we shouldn't be already attached to one kind of future for the child if a different future would be better for the child.
So you would put this more in line with the teenage mother's reasoning.
That's right.
Thinking that even though once that choice has actually been made, there may be some attachments that justify the preference for what's actually happened. But this is a case in which it's merely a matter of attachments leading one to prefer what is objectively a less good scenario.
Right. I think that the details matter, and cochlear implants aren't a perfect cure for deafness, far from it. But the kinds of arguments that get made against cochlear implants often just rely on the fact that it's a big change for the baby, and just rely on the fact that deaf adults are happy to be who they are and are happy to have been deaf. And I think that might be utterly reasonable without it being reasonable to choose that for a baby.
Now, if one watches, for example, Josh Aronson's documentary Sound and Fury, which covered various perspectives both within and outside of the deaf community with respect to cochlear implants, I think that one possible way in which someone might argue that their reasoning isn't being fully captured in our discussion here is that the adults who, say, oppose cochlear implants for deaf infants, they're thinking those infants are already deaf. They're thinking that deaf is an identity, it's a way of being, it's a particular kind of being, a way of being in the world. And so it's not as though we're at this pre-choice point. This baby actually is deaf. That's the baby's identity. And a lot of the concerns that get voiced against cochlear implantation seem to actually take that as a premise. So would that change how you think about these arguments?
I think you're right that people do say things like that, but there's a question of what's going on? What argument is being made? Because of course it's true that the baby, that a newborn baby who's deaf is currently deaf, but it's not true that the baby has already become a part of the social world of the deaf community. That's something that hasn't happened yet. And if a cochlear implant is available, then there are really different alternatives available in the baby's future. And there are many conditions that people are born with where various kinds of therapies or treatments are available, where there are different futures available, and it makes sense to treat the condition, or at least ask the question. So I don't know. I think there are a number of different arguments that get made, and we just have to distinguish them. And so some people do make an argument that has as a premise it's just not any worse to be deaf than to have the ability to hear. And
in particular that it gives one access to a particular community, maybe almost analogous to different, say, ethnic immigrant communities which are outside of the mainstream but nonetheless are vibrant and have their own internal coherence.
Right. And so in a way what I'm really centrally focused on in this work on I'll be glad I did it reasoning is undermining a certain argument for the claim that it's not any worse to be deaf, and an argument that starts from the thought that it's reasonable for a deaf person to be glad to be deaf. And so I think that that's true. I think it's true that it's reasonable for a deaf person to be glad to be deaf and to not wish to have been brought up hearing, because a deaf person might well feel that she would have been such a different person had she been brought up hearing. But I don't think that has the same kind of evidentiary force regarding whether it's a harder life to be deaf, whether there are hardships involved in being deaf that we should spare a baby if we can.
Now, what of other ways of being in the world, other identities that carry with them certain disadvantages? So, for example, suppose, of course, this isn't the case, at least not now medically speaking, but suppose we were able to identify whether a baby would grow up to be a homosexual versus a heterosexual, and suppose that there was a choice then that parents could make if they learned that their child was to be homosexual. They could opt medically to intervene, and the child would instead develop as a heterosexual. How do you think about that sort of case in light of our discussion of cochlear implants?
Good. So I think that that's an important challenge, because I do believe that we should cure deafness in babies if we can. I do not believe that if it were possible to adjust a baby's sexual orientation to make sure that the baby would be heterosexual, I do not believe that we should do that. And so I am drawing a distinction, and we should ask, why is there that distinction? One thing that I think is that I think it's an interesting and hard question to say why we wouldn't be morally required to spare a child all of the prejudice and bad treatment that does unfortunately come along with being homosexual in the world today, in the US today. So I think it's non-trivial to justify letting a child go through that. But I think that there is a justification that can be offered. Mm-hmm. And so part of the story, I think, is that being gay is bad for you and hard for you largely because of prejudice, largely because of bad attitudes in society. Now, it's true that being deaf comes with a lot of hardships because of prejudice, but there are other hardships of being deaf that are not due to prejudice. So that's a difference between the two conditions. And in my view, one explanation of why it wouldn't be morally required to change the sexual orientation of a baby if we could is that it might seem to have this expressive force of agreeing with these prejudiced attitudes. And I think that it's less plausible that choosing a cochlear implant expresses a prejudiced attitude, because being deaf isn't only bad for you because of prejudice.
Well, of course, a lot of members of the deaf community would disagree with that claim and argue
That's really
that it's
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And conversely, you could note that a person who is homosexual is unlikely to be able to conceive a child that's biologically related both to them and to the person that they love. And so that could be construed as a non-societally determined disadvantage.
Yes, I agree with that. And so I think it's an interesting and hard question how to tease the two conditions apart on this question. I do think that we have a real obligation to stand up to prejudice and to do things that are hard for ourselves in the face of prejudice, and that our children have these obligations as well. And ultimately, I think part of the stories about why we shouldn't adjust, why it's not the case that we'd be morally required to adjust our babies so that they escape from all prejudice, part of the story would have to do with the way that our children should stand up against oppression themselves. So I think that choosing to allow a child to grow up in a way that she'll experience prejudice is a lot like the choice to send a child to be one of the first children to integrate schools. It's a very hard thing for the child to go through, but it may be the right choice to make.
"I'll be glad I did it" reasoning strikes us as excellent reasoning in many cases. Yet it can also lead us astray, such as when a teenager relies on it in deciding to conceive. Professor Harman, it's been wonderful having you with us. Thanks so much for coming and joining us on Philosophical Conversations.
Thank you for having me, Sarah Jane.